Hi y'all. Alright, let's get started with vessels A. I think you'll find that I'm going to repeat myself because I've already done the lab, and there's a lot of things that I mentioned in lab that, especially on this particular vessels A, that you're fixing to see. So, of course you already know this. The blood vessels are the guys that are sending the blood from the heart to the tissues, to the lungs, and then back. There's going to be a pressure inside there. There's going to be a pounding pressure of that blood hitting those vessel walls that's going to cause a little bit of the plasma to leak out. Mostly water, maybe some electrolytes, but nothing big should leave a vessel ever unless there's pathology. It's normal to lose a little bit of that plasma with the mostly water, and then the lymphatic system is going to scoop it back up and it's going to dump it back into the subclavians. So from lab, there was the thoracic duct. He's doing almost everything. And then we have the right lymphatic duct that's draining the head and the right arm. Part of the right chest too, but he's not gathering as nearly as much as that thoracic duct. Both of them are dumping the right lymphatic duct is dumping into the right subclavian. The thoracic duct is going to loop around and dump into the left subclavian. All right, and then this is easy, right? Arteries are carrying away from the heart. It's usually oxygenated because most of our vessels are systemic, but we've got some exceptions, and you've already met those. So easy peasy. Going to the lungs, that's leaving the heart, going to the lungs for the purpose of getting oxygenated. So that's going to be deoxygenated blood. And then actually in the fetus, the umbilical artery is going to be deoxygenated, heading, or to both of them, there's two of them, going to be heading to the placenta to get oxygenated. In the fetus, the placenta is the lungs. So then it's going to leave that placenta. You have an umbilical vein, one umbilical vein, and that guy's going to be oxygenated because he just left the placenta. All right. Capillaries, they're going to be where the gas exchange is happening. So big vessels get a little bit smaller, get a little bit smaller, get a little bit smaller, and turn into arterial capillaries where it's dropping off oxygen. And then it's a continuous loop. So as it keeps passing by, it's losing oxygen, gaining carbon dioxide, and then now it's going to be on the venous side. So still a capillary, but it's going to be a much more deoxygenated capillary. So it's going to be blue at that point. And that point in between where there's what's called a capillary bed, where it's very much fanning out into the tiniest little section of passageways, that's usually depicted as purple because we're losing some oxygen, we're gaining some carbon dioxide. So red to purple to blue. And then veins, obviously. Okay, so I'm spending way too much more time on this slide. Okay, these are the vessels as they leave and go back to the heart. So here's the heart. These are the ones that I usually call the great vessels. Their names are elastic arteries. Sometimes they get called conducting arteries. The reason that they're called elastic is because they have a lot of elastin fiber in them, because they're receiving all that pressure from the ventricles. So that ventricle is squeezing. That is the greatest pressure is being received right there at the elastic vessels. We want them to be able to stretch and go back to the way that they were. As you come down a little bit, we're going to have some guys called muscular arteries. Those muscular arteries are still going to be named arteries. Most of our vessels are falling that you know names to are going to be in this level right here. As you move on down, they're getting tinier and tinier, so now we're becoming arterioles, and they're going to branch into a capillary bed. So we have these little capillary systems going off like this, exchanging gases, picking up some carbon dioxide, and now we're moving back into the venous system. So all of these are capillaries. This little section right here is venule. So his name is post-capillary venule. Notice this guy is terminal arterial. And then we got capillaries. Capillaries don't get names. They're just capillaries. And then we just work our way up. Small veins, large veins. Can you even guess what the pressure is by the time you're getting up here? Boom, 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 boom. Trickle, help. Oh my gosh, I gotta get all the way up there. No. So I mentioned this in lab. That center part, whenever you have a center part that's empty, that things can pass through. So the lumen of the gut, the lumen of the bronchi. Here we have the lumen of the vessels, and of course we know what that guy's going to fill. It's going to be full with blood. Told you about these little layers inside the lab section. So the most interior part of that vessel wall is going to be called tunica intima. The part that has a lot more smooth muscle for artery, not so much in venous, but has some. That's called tunica media. Media, middle muscle. And tunica externa, of course, is connective tissue on the outside. Some of them are a little bit more than just connective tissue. Now, capillaries, the only thing they have, remember, they're exchanging the gases. So they're just going to be, it's endothelium, continuous with the endocardium in the heart. It's just that simple squamous epithelial layer. Okay, so tunica intima is where the heart's touch, the blood is touching. So endothelium going into endocardium. It's all simple squamous. It's slick. You can feel the slickness on the inside of the vessels, and we don't want any friction, right? This is the problem with plaques, with getting plaque buildup. That's creating friction, which is messing with blood flow. Get to that later. And then that endothelium is actually laying on a basement membrane. We've mentioned basement membrane occasionally in AMP1 and AMP2. It doesn't impede with exchange. It's a very fine layer of connective tissue. Okay, then we have the tunica media. Media, middle muscle. Of course, it's smooth muscle. You're not in charge telling your blood vessels, okay, this is a good time to dilate. No, you don't have to do that. You're going to have the nervous system helping you out with that. You're going to have the hormones helping you out with that. You're going to have kidney responses helping you out with that. So vasoconstriction is when it gets tighter, the lumen gets smaller. Vasodilation is when it loosens up, widens up, and the lumen gets wider. Of course, if he's doing vasoconstriction and vasodilation, well, he's the one that's changing your blood flow. He's the one that's changing your blood pressure. Tunica media is very important for homeostasis. All right, tunica externa or tunica adventitia. This is the outermost layer, okay? So we've got some just connective tissue, some collagen, tiny little blood vessels. Depends on how big the actual vessel is. So if you can imagine that great big thick aorta, he's going to have more blood vessels in his tunica externa. Those little blood vessels are actually helping feed the vessel, because remember, it's made of a bunch of cells, and so the cells need oxygen too, so he's kind of feeding himself. Isn't that weird? But the bigger the vessel, the more obvious these little blood vessels will be. That little area of blood vessels, that little smattering of blood vessels, is called the vasorum. And then there's nerve fibers in there. There's lymphatic vessels in there. Those large veins are going to have some elastic fibers in this layer. So here's a picture. So you have the endothelial layer. So there's the endothelium, nice and smooth, continuous with the endocardium. And then there's a basement membrane layer. All right, in the arteries, we're going to have elastic sheets on the outside. Well, I should put it here, the outside of the muscle and the inside of the muscle, because we're having constant expansion and contraction of that vessel, because these guys, the smooth muscles, are going to be contracting, relaxing. There's also some elastic fibers that are in here that aren't drawn. And then the tunica externa, so connective tissue. We've got some collagen. You can see the smattering of some blood vessels, so tiny little capillaries that have oxygenated blood, deoxygenated blood, and lymphatics, and of course there's always nerves. That's always a trio: arteries, veins, nerves. It's hard to see the nerves, right? The nerve fibers, but they're there. It's always a trio. So, gosh, I should have combined this slide. So we have elastic arteries, muscular arteries, and then they're going to go to arterioles. The elastic arteries, like I said earlier, those are the great vessels that are leaving the heart. So they are thick, low resistance. So we're not going to have a whole lot of vasodilation, vasoconstriction in that area. We want him to be constant. We need him to be able to stretch out and receive that blood. We need him to go back to the regular size that he was. If he starts to stretch out and stretch out and stretch out and blow, that's an aneurysm. That's bad. So these guys, they're going to allow for continuous blood flow downstream, even between heartbeats. He is allowing that blood to flow evenly. We don't want any blood to flow in spurts. Even when the heart is relaxing, we need flow. We do not want a blood clot. After elastic arteries, they're going to start to get all kinds of names. They're muscular arteries, but you know, the femoral artery that you met, the popliteal artery that you met. These are all muscular arteries. These guys are going to have the thickest smooth muscle because they're doing the majority of the vasoconstriction and vasodilation. These guys are really the guys that are changing your blood pressure continuously all the time. Arterioles, they don't get names anymore. They're smartery. They're going to go smallest. They're going to go into the capillaries. Of course, those guys don't have names either. The smaller they get, the less stuff that they have. So the smallest arterioles just have a tiny little smooth muscle layer. They are controlling the flow into the capillary bed, though. Why is that important? Well, those capillaries, remember, all they have is that simple squamous. We don't want to blow them out. So if we are suddenly rapidly raising our blood pressure there, then these little areas, these little tiny arterioles, are going to vasoconstrict so that we don't pound those capillaries. So sometimes because of that, they're called resistant arteries. Capillaries are so small that sometimes even the red blood cells have to turn themselves sideways. So sometimes the diameter is actually slightly less than the diameter of a red blood cell. This is where gases exchange. Hey, do you need some glucose? Here you go. Hey, is there hormone supposed to be going into that? Here you go. This is where all those kind of things exchange. So just with that simple squamous, that's just going to be called tunica intima. We have stem cells hanging around those guys. They're called pericytes. They can allow repair of any tiny little tears. Did you get your finger pricked to see if you were anemic or whatever? We're going to have a pericyte go fix that. We have capillaries almost to every single cell. Now, you know already that when you look at cartilage underneath the microscope, you're not going to see blood vessels there. The epithelium, you're not going to see blood vessels there. The cornea, The cornea actually has no blood vessels. I think we went over that in AMP1. And then the lens of the eye. So the humors around the cornea. So the aqueous humor is going to help nourish the cornea. The vitreous humor and the aqueous humor is going to help out the lens of the eye. Capillary bed. This is the passageway. This is depicting parasites for repair. So we go hard elastic arteries, muscular arteries, arterioles, capillaries, postcapillary venules, veins. Okay, now this is interesting. We have different kind of capillaries. Okay, so we're going to go through the different ones. We have continuous capillaries, we have fenestrated capillaries, and then we have sinusoidal capillaries. The different names depict on how much fluid they actually will allow out of them. So when you get down to the sinusoidals, they actually have pretty darn big gaps in them. So I'm going to show you pictures of those. The continuous capillaries, those guys actually are quite tight. So these guys don't allow a lot of fluid loss. They're the most common ones. You see them in the skin, muscle, lungs, central nervous system, and even in the blood-brain barrier. He's very odd. So he is a continuous capillary, but he is totally filled up with tight junctions and no clefts. So I'm going to show you a picture in between the two. These intercellular clefts are like channels between cells. Remember that blood-brain barrier? It's very hard for even drugs sometimes to get in there. So it's very tight. We need to protect that brain. He's a weirdo. Most of our capillaries are continuous, and the blood-brain barrier is one of those super tight continuous capillaries. So least permeable. All right, so let's look at this. Here we got simple squamous, simple squamous, simple squamous. Okay, and then we have these little breaks in between the cells. And I've tried to depict these on the board before where there's these tiny little gaps, right? This is an intercellular cleft where something can sneak out. Now, we do have tight junctions where they're actually overlapping over each other, right? You've heard of those guys before. A fenestrated capillary is going to allow a little bit more filtration. When we do kidneys, you'll see that at the glomerulus, this guy is where we're having filtration. So a passive process where we're kind of cleaning out the blood. That fenestrated capillary, he's called that because I'll show you in just a second. Those endothelial cells, so those simple squamous cells, have little Swiss cheese holes. The Swiss cheese holes allow for more stuff to pass through them, so therefore more permeable. So here you go. All those little all those little Swiss cheese holes right there, they're called fenestrations. So now we're not just passing through intercellular clefts, and of course through cell membranes, right? This is another way to just simply sneak out, like that white blood cell that just wants to sneak out. It's going to make a little foot and sneak through that cleft. Well, look, here's tiny little holes to help him out. So this is, you can see, this is going to allow for more things to pass through it. Sinusoidal capillaries, they got not just holes, they got gaps. Less tight junctions, larger clefts, larger lumens. We're going to see these guys in the liver, the bone marrow, the spleen, and there's some macrophages usually hanging around with sinusoidal capillaries. So look at that. That intracellular cleft is like a canyon right there. Intracellular cleft, intracellular cleft. There's an occasional tight junction. Look at those little, this is not baby Swiss, this is just regular old Swiss cheese now. So these guys allow for the largest amount of things to pass through them. in the liver, let me do the liver real quick. It's just the liver is so cool. Those macrophages that I would just mention, there's some macrophages that are hanging out right around these capillaries, and they can actually even just reaching in here or reaching through these little holes to grab things. And the liver is a filter organ, so there's more things to grab there. Okay, so here we go. We have an arterial, a venule, and blood flowing through. Ooh, all nice and everything. Okay, you just got really cold. You decided to dip your hand into an ice bucket. Okay. Well, your body says, wait a minute, I need to conserve some heat. So, and you can live without your hand. So what's going to happen is that arteriole is going to vasoconstrict. It's going to clamp down. And then look, you're impeding some of the flow of blood to the capillaries. And your hand actually starts to become paler in color, and you're having less blood flow. If you stayed in there for a really long time and it was really cold, you'd get frostbite and you'd lose your fingers, because you can live without your fingers. You can block all the blood supply to your fingers, and your fingers will fall off and you're going to make it. This is all those vessels that are superficial. Now, if you are out in the Arctic and you are freezing to death, all of your vessels are going to vasoconstrict except the super important ones that are keeping you alive. The vessels that are going to your heart, to your brain, to your kidneys, to your liver, those guys are going to act oppositely and vasodilate to make sure that's where all the blood's going. Okay, veins. Veins carry towards the heart. We have a whole lot more veins than we do arteries. They're thinner, they're floppier. You can feel the difference. I mentioned this in lab. Tunica media, there is some smooth muscle, but not very much. And the tunica externa is going to, externa is going to be thicker. But you definitely can tell the difference when you squeeze an artery, when you squeeze a vein. The vein is just squishy. The artery is thick and ropey. Those large lumen, thin walls make them storage for blood. So they actually carry the majority of your blood. They call them a blood reservoir. So here's a picture, a little bit prettier than the one from lab. Lots of staining. You can really appreciate all that elastin inside that artery. So tunica intima, quite thick. Tunica intima over here, not so much. Okay, look at this. This guy is staying nice and round. So maybe this is an arteriole and this is a venule. Remember, they all pair up together. There's a vein in here, a nerve in here somewhere, but you usually can't see them because of the tiny little cross section, and you're just catching, part of an axon. So, okay, so tunica intima, smooth muscle here, tunica media, and then we have tunica externa, and then this fine little layer right here, tunica intima, maybe one cell layer thick of tunica media, and then lots of tunica externa. He's collapsing. He's floppy. He's staying open. Floppy, venous side, thick and sturdy, arterial side. Okay, I'm gonna, not to belabor the point, you can read. Okay. I got a lot of pictures in here. And of course, what's the lumen full of? Little red blood cells, right? Okay, so because the blood pressure is through the floor in a vein, we're going to have some sort of changes that are different in the veins from what's in the arteries, okay? So they have their lumen is usually a larger diameter, so we don't have as much resistance for blood flow. We're going to have some valves in there. So we have valves. I think I told you in lab, you can find your valves through mapping, which is not testable really for all practical purposes. But the purpose of these guys is to prevent backflow. So once your muscles have squeezed some of the blood up your leg, there's going to be a valve right there that keeps it from going back down, keep it from being pulled by gravity. We have some venous sinuses, and you've met the coronary sinus, and maybe you remember the different dural sinuses of the brain from AMP1. So these are really thin-walled, kind of collecting areas for venous systems. I'm not going to read that slide. I've already talked about all that, but you're welcome to go through that. Just another little summary of the differences between the kinds of blood vessels there. Okay, so vessels, again, you've been through all this. So blood goes left atrium, left ventricle, and up through the aorta to all the systems. All the cells are going to get some oxygen. All the cells are going to give up some carbon dioxide, and it's going to collect in the inferior vena cava and be brought back to, and the superior vena cava. This is just depicting one loop. So going into the right atrium to the right ventricle, pulmonary trunk, and left and right pulmonary artery, all deoxygenated to go to the lungs to get reoxygenated. Mentioned this the other day. A varicose vein is just where those veins have collapsed. So they're tired. The vessel has gotten, it's usually hereditary, and the vessel starts to get a little bit dilated. You can actually see it. It becomes more to the surface. Although veins are usually more, veins are more superficial than arteries. If you stand on your legs all the time, like if you're going to be a nurse, you should wear supportive hose. That supportive hose helps squeeze the legs so that it helps with venous return. So that we're not relying so much on those veins. That helps us fight that gravity so that you don't have failure of the valves. Pregnancy is another thing. You start to get some pooling of blood in the limbs because there's a giant baby in the way. So it's hindering the blood going back up. You've probably heard of hemorrhoids, right? Hemorrhoids are actually like varicose veins. A hemorrhoidal vein is actually its name, and it's living in the rectum. But when it prolapses out, it's because you have failed those veins, and now there are varicosities. There are varicose veins. Okay, sometimes we're going to have alternate pathways. They're going to be called an Anastomoses. You can have vascular or arterial, and you can have venous. Venous are pretty common. You can see them in your hands where we have alternate pathways for the blood. And I mentioned before that, like your venous pathway, you can't, like, not everybody's venous system is exactly the same. So, maybe they'll ask you, do people usually draw blood from your left arm or your right arm? Well, maybe your right arm has got weird pathways. So, anyway. Arterial anastomoses offer another way for blood to get to an area that's blocked. So you actually have some arterial anastomoses in your heart to help you out. But you can also grow vessels. It's called angiogenesis, where you can create new pathways and offer an alternative pathway. But we're born with some arterial anastomoses to offer for a different pathway in case an artery gets blocked.